Burnt out, running on empty. Maybe you've never heard this before, but God did not just create the world that we live in. He created rest. On the seventh day, God rested. And that rest that He created has never ended. After the uncomfortable, in-your-face warning about not entering God's rest that we had at the end of the previous chapter, the fourth chapter of Hebrews opens up with a stunning statement. In spite of that warning, the promise of entering God's rest still remains. In spite of Israel's failure, the promise of entering God's rest is still ours today. Israel failed to enter God's rest because of unbelief. In fact, their unbelief barred them from entering it. But the promise of entering God's rest is still possible. It's still available. And you and I can enter it. If those truths exist side by side, Israel failed to enter it, but that rest is still possible, still available to us, and we can enter it. We need to look very closely at what happened to Israel. See, because the good news of what would happen if they totally trusted and relied upon God was preached to Israel, just as it is preached to us through the gospel of Jesus Christ. They heard that exact same invitation, but it didn't do them any good. And if we don't realize what made the gospel useless to them, then we're in danger of falling into exactly the same trap. Fortunately, we don't have to speculate about this because the author's clear. They failed to mix what God had spoken to them with faith. And here's how I think this happens. Every day we face pain and pressure, uncertainty and fear. And right in the middle of all of that is when what God has spoken to us needs to speak. And it needs to work its way into every fiber of our attitudes, beliefs, motives, and perspective. If it's not our reality, then we're not going to respond out of its truth. And this doesn't just happen with a one-time decision. It means that we must hear the good news of God's great salvation in Christ, what we were created and destined for, what God has done to make it possible in Christ, and then interpret everything that happens in our life through that lens. And here's where I think the weight of this is. God's love for us, the purpose for which He created us, the commitment He has to fulfilling that purpose for us is just beyond our mental comprehension. And what God has prepared for us in Christ and the power of His work within our lives is beyond our imagination. And so what happens when we start looking at life through the lens of everyday pressures and experiences that we have to face, the false significance and security that the world has to offer us, the trouble and pain that life throws at us, the weakness and failures that we see in us, create an onslaught of sensory information. And under that onslaught, what God has done for us in Christ, what God has spoken to us in Christ, seems so obscure. We don't pay much attention to it. We don't fully tune into it. We don't focus our attention on it. And so it just simply becomes a church doctrine, a Christian teaching that never becomes a lived reality for us. I want you to think about that. It just becomes a church doctrine, a Christian teaching that never becomes a lived reality for us. And I want that thought to leave you trembling. I really do. Trembling with longing to know God's rest. Trembling with longing to understand what it means to enter into that rest. trembling with a healthy fear that it could be possible for you and many who started to listen to this teaching today to hear the message, but never enter into God's rest as a lived reality. As much as it lies within me to teach you, to encourage you, and to warn you, for the few that remain and continue to press in this teaching, I am praying and believing God that you will enter into the fullness of God's rest. I'll see you next time.